The bustling streets were no stranger to Victoria Mason, a woman of great wealth and an equally generous heart. Known for her charitable actions and elegant presence, Victoria often found herself drawn to the less fortunate. It was on a particularly cold autumn afternoon that her life, and the lives of those around her, would change forever. When Victoria's sleek black car stopped near a park, her keen eyes spotted a boy huddled against the stone wall of a building. His clothes were tattered, and his face, though dirty with soil, displayed an expression of resilience and determination. Victoria's heart tightened, and she felt an immediate urge to help. She approached the boy, feeling a pull in her chest that she had never felt before. "Excuse me," she called softly, stepping out of the car and moving closer to the boy. "Are you all right, dear?" The boy looked up, his deep blue eyes filled with a mixture of caution and curiosity. "I'm fine, ma'am," he replied, his voice firm despite his evident hardships. "Just trying to stay warm." Victoria's heart ached. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Anthony," he replied, standing up to face her, his posture proud yet humble. "Anthony Miller." "Where are your parents, Anthony?" Victoria asked, already suspecting the tragic answer. "They're gone," Anthony said simply, his eyes momentarily clouding with sadness before regaining their resolute shine. "I've been alone for a while." Victoria made her decision in an instant. She remembered her son, Daniel, who was constantly ill and often alone. "Anthony, how about coming home with me until we find a place where you can be well? I have a son, Daniel, who could use a friend like you." Anthony's eyes widened in surprise. "Are you sure, ma'am? I'm just a street kid." "Nonsense," Victoria said firmly. "You're not just anything. You're coming with me." Victoria made sure to contact social services before taking him home, to ensure more information about Anthony, and to confirm he had no other relatives or legal issues. The officials confirmed that Anthony was indeed alone, and with that, she felt even more determined to help. Later that day, when Victoria's car pulled into the driveway of her imposing home, Anthony marveled at the opulence around him. The staff greeted Victoria warmly and looked at Anthony with curiosity but without judgment. "This is Anthony," Victoria introduced him to the housekeeper, Mrs. Jenkins. "He'll be staying with us." Mrs. Jenkins smiled kindly. "Welcome, young man. We'll make sure you feel at home." Victoria took Anthony to a cozy and well-furnished room. "This will be your room," she said, opening the door. "And now let's meet Daniel." In the luxurious mansion, a frail boy was sitting in a wheelchair, absorbed in a book. He looked up as they entered, his face lighting up with curiosity. "Daniel, this is Anthony," Victoria introduced them. "He will stay with us and keep you company." Daniel's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Hi, Anthony. Do you like books?" "I have lots of them." Anthony smiled. "I love books. Maybe you can show me some of your favorites." Victoria watched with joy as the two boys instantly hit it off, discussing stories and characters with enthusiasm. It was rare to see Daniel so animated, and she felt a sense of hope blossoming within her. That evening during dinner, Victoria's husband, Richard, joined them at the table. He was a stern man, his demeanor often bordering on cold. However, he maintained a facade of support as Victoria introduced Anthony. "So, Anthony," Richard said, his tone friendly but with an undertone of something else, "what do you think of our home?" "It's very beautiful, sir," Anthony replied politely. "Good to hear," Richard responded, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something darker, jealousy perhaps or resentment. As days turned into weeks, Anthony became an integral part of the household. He was resourceful, kind, and quickly won the affection of the staff and Daniel. The two boys became inseparable, and Daniel's health seemed to improve with the new companionship. However, Richard's initial facade of support began to crumble. He made subtle, cutting remarks about Anthony, questioning his background and intentions. Victoria, though aware of her husband's growing dissatisfaction, was determined to protect Anthony and nurture the bond between him and Daniel. One night, as Victoria and Richard were getting ready for bed, the tension between them became palpable. "Richard, what's bothering you?" Victoria asked, her voice a mix of concern and frustration. "I just don't think it's wise to bring a street kid into our home," Richard replied, his tone sharp. "You know nothing about him." "He's been nothing but kind and helpful," Victoria countered. "And Daniel adores him." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Just be careful, Victoria. Not everyone is what they seem." As Victoria lay down that night, her mind swirled with conflicting thoughts. She loved her husband, but she couldn't ignore his evident concern. She decided to stay vigilant, determined to protect her family. Victoria Mason was sitting in her office, the soft lamplight casting a serene glow over the room. Outside, the city's busy sounds were a distant hum, a stark contrast to the growing tension within her home. Recently, she had installed hidden cameras throughout the house, mainly under the pretense of monitoring her son Daniel's health and well-being. Few knew that she also hoped they would provide clarity about the growing unease she felt regarding her husband, Richard. Richard had started planting seeds of doubt in Victoria's mind about Anthony, the orphan boy she had taken in. "He's too clever for his own good," Richard would say, his voice laced with a disturbing mix of disdain and suspicion. "You don't even know where he came from. How can you trust him with Daniel?" Victoria often found herself pondering these questions late into the night. She had seen the bond forming between Daniel and Anthony, how Anthony's presence seemed to breathe new life into her ailing son. But Richard's words gnawed at her mind, creating a storm of conflicting emotions. One night, after a particularly tense dinner where Richard had been unusually cold to both Daniel and Anthony, Victoria retreated to her office to review the camera footage. As she watched, her heart sank. There was Richard, dismissing Daniel's attempts at conversation with an impatient wave, his face a mask of irritation. In another clip, Richard could be seen glaring at Anthony with a look full of unspoken hostility. The next day, Richard's accusations took a more serious turn. "Victoria, I think Anthony has been stealing from us," he announced over breakfast, his tone dripping with feigned concern. "I've noticed some valuable items missing." Victoria's eyes widened in shock. "What? Are you sure?" "Absolutely. We need to search his room," Richard insisted. Reluctantly, Victoria agreed. They searched Anthony's modest room but found nothing out of place. No stolen items, no evidence of wrongdoing. Anthony stood there, confused and hurt. "I didn't take anything, Mrs. Mason," he pleaded, his voice trembling. "I swear." "I believe you, Anthony," Victoria said softly, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. She turned to Richard, her expression hardening. "There is no evidence to support your claims. This needs to stop." That night, the tension between Victoria and Richard reached a breaking point. They were in the dimly lit library, the air thick with unspoken accusations. "Why are you so determined to undermine Anthony?" Victoria demanded, her voice shaking with frustration. "He's only brought joy to our son." Richard's face twisted in anger. "He's a stranger, Victoria. We don't know what his intentions are. For all we know, he could be taking advantage of us. Or maybe it's you who's taking advantage," Victoria retorted, her eyes narrowing. "I've seen how you treat Daniel. The coldness, the indifference. What is really going on, Richard?" For a moment, Richard looked surprised, but he quickly recovered, his expression hardening. "You don't know what you're talking about." The room fell silent, the weight of Victoria's words hanging heavily between them. Richard's face turned red with anger and shame, but he said nothing. With one last piercing look, Victoria turned and left the room, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. As she walked down the hallway, Victoria felt a sense of resolve settling within her. She would protect her son and the boy who had become like a second son to her, at any cost. The truth was beginning to surface, and she was determined to uncover it fully, even if it meant confronting the man she once loved. The friendship between Anthony and Daniel blossomed into a deep, unbreakable bond. Every morning, Anthony sat by Daniel's bed, reading stories that transported them to far-off lands and thrilling adventures. Daniel, confined to his room due to his chronic illness, found solace and joy in Anthony's presence. Their laughter echoed through the mansion, a sound that brought a rare smile to Victoria's face. One afternoon, as the sun cast a golden hue across the room, Daniel turned to Anthony with a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Anthony, do you think we can build a model airplane together?" "Of course, Daniel," Anthony replied, his voice filled with enthusiasm. "I'll bring all the materials and we can start right now." The two boys spent hours meticulously building the model airplane, their hands working in sync, their spirits lifted by each other's company. Victoria watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude for the joy Anthony had brought into her son's life. However, Richard's jealousy had reached a boiling point. He began to manipulate the household staff, whispering insidious lies about Anthony. "You know, I've noticed some things missing around the house," he told Maria, the housekeeper. "I wouldn't be surprised if that boy had something to do with it." Maria, loyal to Victoria and fond of Anthony, hesitated. "Mr. Mason, Anthony has been nothing but kind and helpful. I find it hard to believe he would steal." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Just keep an eye on him, Maria. We can't be too careful." Despite Richard's attempts to sow discord, Victoria's faith in Anthony remained unshaken. She continued to review the hidden camera footage in secret, hoping to find clarity. What she discovered made her blood run cold. Richard wasn't just undermining Anthony. He was actively sabotaging him. In one clip, Richard was seen deliberately knocking over a vase and then blaming Anthony for the mess. In another, he hid Daniel's medication, causing a panic when it couldn't be found. Victoria's hands trembled as she watched the footage, her mind racing. One fateful night, Daniel's condition worsened. His breathing became labored, and his skin turned pale. Anthony, ever vigilant, recognized the signs and rushed to Victoria's room. "Mrs. Mason, it's Daniel. We need to call the doctor." Victoria acted immediately, dialing the emergency number with shaking hands. "Please come quickly," she pleaded, her voice breaking. Anthony stayed by Daniel's side, holding his hand and whispering words of comfort. "Hang in there, Daniel. Help is on the way." The doctor arrived in time, administering the necessary treatment to stabilize Daniel. Victoria watched in awe as Anthony's calm and quick thinking saved her son's life. Tears filled her eyes, a mixture of relief and gratitude. When Daniel regained consciousness, he looked at Anthony with weak but grateful eyes. "Thank you, Anthony," he whispered. "I knew you wouldn't let anything happen to me." Victoria's heart ached with a blend of love for her son and admiration for Anthony. She realized that Richard's jealousy wasn't just directed at Anthony, but also at Daniel, whom he had never truly cared for. Victoria Mason began to notice that something was deeply wrong with her husband, Richard. It all started with small changes that, initially, she didn't give much importance to. Richard, once sociable and charismatic, began avoiding contact with family and friends. He claimed to be busy or tired, but Victoria noticed that he simply didn't want to be around anyone. As time passed, Richard became increasingly distant. He spent long hours locked in his office, often late into the night. When Victoria asked what he was doing, he responded evasively or showed irritation. Victoria's suspicions grew when she found strange financial documents and received calls from unknown numbers, which Richard denied knowing anything about. Richard's behavior also changed drastically at home. He became cold and indifferent, especially toward Daniel. Richard rarely showed any affection for his son and frequently criticized his physical limitations. The relationship between Richard and Victoria also took a hit. He ceased to be the loving husband she had known and became someone dark, calculating, and sometimes even threatening. Victoria began to suspect that Richard was hiding something terrible. His whispered phone conversations and the way he abruptly ended calls when he noticed her presence heightened her suspicions. She felt he was planning something, and this feeling grew stronger every day. The growing animosity of Richard and his suspicious behavior led Victoria to believe that he was hiding a dark secret. They grew emotionally and physically distant. The affection and closeness they once shared disappeared, replaced by constant tension. Richard seemed to be always on edge, as if he were planning something terrible. Victoria Mason sat in her office, her mind agitated with conflicting emotions. She had always believed in the sanctity of her marriage, but recent revelations had shaken her deeply. Determined to uncover the full truth, she decided to hire a private detective to investigate Richard's past. She needed to understand the roots of his manipulative behavior and his coldness toward Daniel. The detective, a meticulous and discreet man named James Thornton, began his work immediately. In a few days, he uncovered disturbing details about Richard's troubled childhood. Richard had grown up in a loveless home, with an emotionally abusive father and an indifferent mother. This environment had shaped Richard into a person who saw affection as a weakness and manipulation as a survival tool. Meanwhile, at the Mason household, Richard's attempts to turn the staff against Anthony began to crumble. The staff, who had grown fond of the kind and helpful boy, started to see through Richard's lies. Maria, the housekeeper, was the first to voice her doubts. "I don't believe a word Mr. Richard says about Anthony," she confided to the cook, Mrs. Jenkins. "That boy has been a blessing for Master Daniel." Mrs. Jenkins nodded in agreement. "I've seen how Mr. Richard treats Anthony and even Daniel when he thinks no one's looking. It's not right, Maria. It's not right." As Victoria continued to review the hidden camera footage, she found undeniable proof that Richard had been emotionally abusive toward Daniel. One video in particular left her in tears. It showed Richard scolding Daniel for not being strong enough and accusing him of being a burden. Anthony, standing nearby, tried to comfort Daniel, only to be rudely shoved by Richard. Her heart ached as she watched the scene unfold. She knew she needed to act, but the tension in the house was already at a breaking point. Richard's jealousy and manipulative behavior were becoming more dangerous by the day. The climax came one night when Richard tried to frame Anthony for a serious crime. He planted a valuable family heirloom in Anthony's room, and then called an emergency family meeting. "Victoria, Daniel, everyone!" he shouted, his voice full of false urgency. "I've just discovered something terrible." Anthony stood in the corner, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. Victoria, sensing something was wrong, calmly walked to Anthony's room, followed by the rest of the household. Richard dramatically opened a drawer, revealing the heirloom. "There it is. Anthony has been stealing from us." Before anyone could react, Victoria stepped forward, her voice firm. "Richard, stop this charade." She turned to the butler, Mr. Thompson. "Please bring the footage from the cameras in Anthony's room." Richard's face paled. "What cameras?" he stammered. Victoria didn't answer and headed towards her office. The tension in the Mason household reached its peak. Victoria knew it was time to confront Richard with the mountain of evidence she had collected. She gathered her courage and decided to face him in the grand living room, a place that once symbolized their unity but now felt like a battleground. Richard was sitting in his favorite armchair, sipping a glass of whiskey. When Victoria entered, he looked up, noticing the storm in her eyes. "Richard," Victoria began, her voice steady, "we need to talk." Richard raised an eyebrow, feigning ignorance. "About what, dear?" Victoria took a deep breath and placed a stack of documents on the coffee table between them. "About this," she said, pointing to the stack. "About everything you've done." Richard's eyes narrowed. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb with me, Richard," Victoria snapped. "I installed hidden cameras around the house. I've seen how you treat Daniel, your own stepson. I've seen how you've sabotaged Anthony, how you've manipulated the staff." Richard's face turned red with anger. "You had no right to spy on me. I had every right to protect my son and the boy who has become like a brother to him," Victoria shot back. "And it's not just the cameras. I hired a private detective who uncovered your troubled past and your manipulative behavior." Richard stood up abruptly, knocking over his glass. "This is ridiculous. You can't take the word of a street kid over your own husband." At that moment, Anthony entered the room, holding a small notebook. "She's not just taking my word," he said calmly. "I've been keeping my own records of everything you've done." Richard glared at Anthony. You little spy. How dare you? Anthony remained unfazed. How dare you treat Daniel the way you have? How dare you try to frame me for things I didn't do? Victoria stepped between them, her resolve unwavering. Richard, it's over. I've already called the police. They're on their way. Richard's face twisted in rage. You can't do this to me, Victoria. You'll regret this. No, Victoria said softly but firmly. The only thing I regret is not seeing your true nature sooner. Within minutes, the police arrived, and Richard was taken into custody. As he was led away, he continued to hurl threats and accusations, but Victoria ignored him. Her focus was now on her son and Anthony. Following Richard's arrest, Victoria wasted no time in filing for divorce. She ensured that Richard would have no further contact with Daniel, securing his safety and well-being. The relief in the household was palpable. The dark cloud that had hung over them for so long was finally lifting. With Richard gone, Daniel's health began to improve. The constant stress and fear had taken their toll, but now, surrounded by love and care, he started to thrive. Anthony remained by his side, their bond growing stronger each day. One night, as they sat together in the living room, Daniel looked at Victoria and Anthony with a smile. I feel like I have a real family now, he said softly. Victoria's eyes filled with tears of joy. You do, dear. We are a family. In a small, private ceremony, Victoria officially adopted Anthony. The moment was filled with emotion as they signed the papers, solidifying the bond that had grown between them. Anthony, once a lonely orphan on the streets, now had a home and a family who loved him. The three stood together, looking out at the city that had brought them so much pain and triumph. Victoria knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but with Daniel and Anthony by her side, she felt ready to face any challenge that came their way. As they embraced, Victoria whispered, "This is a new chapter for us, free from the past and full of hope for the future." And so the Mason household began a new, happier chapter in their lives. The shadows of Richard's toxic influence were gone, replaced by the warmth and light of a true loving family.